Hi everybody, in this video we're going to talk about external or guest access to our Office 365 resources. Now the idea of guest access or external users is not a new one. In fact, it's been with us for almost as long as Office 365 has been around. We've always wanted to give external people access to, for instance, our SharePoint sites or lists, libraries, documents, and actually SharePoint was one of the first tools in Office 365 to offer this ability, and it obviously it still does. One of the things you can do with SharePoint, in fact, that we normally don't do is you can give people anonymous access. In other words, allow people without a username and a password to access our SharePoint lists, libraries, or documents. You can actually still do this. You can tell SharePoint, hey, I'd just like to send people a link, and anyone that has this link, they don't have to authenticate, we'll just let them in. That's not normally what we think of when we think of guest access to our Office 365 tenant, but we can still do that. For the most part though, we'd actually prefer when people come in that they have a username and a password. So in this video, we're going to focus mostly on those external or guest users. And for the video, I'm going to start calling them just guest users, although they're pretty much the same thing. Guest user, external user, we can use these terms interchangeably. So we want to give a guest user access to our resources, like a SharePoint list or a library. And we want to make sure these people authenticate, so they have a username and a password. So how do we do that? Well, let's start off by talking about two different choices right off the bat. Number one, we could actually just create a user in our Office 365, give them a password, and then tell the person from outside of our company, hey, I just gave you a username and a password, here it is, now you can come in and gain access to that library that you needed to gain access to. Yeah, that'll work, but you can see right away that's going to be a pain in the neck. We don't want to deal with these people's passwords. Their password on our Office 365 is not going to be the password they normally use for wherever they are, so they're going to have to remember our password and their password. Of course, they're going to forget the password for our system, so we're going to have to deal with password resets, and that's just something we don't want to deal with. It would work with maybe a couple of people, but once you get to 10, 100, or a few hundred people, it's completely unworkable. So for the most part, what we'd like to do is somehow let people use their current username and password, but still allow them to access our Office 365 resources. And we can do that. The way we do that is with the idea of federation. Now, federation is not a specific Office 365 idea. We use it all the time on the internet. In fact, you use it probably when you're browsing the web and going to different things. Whenever you go to a website and it asks you, hey, would you like to log on as your Facebook account or your Google account? You're actually using federation. What happens is the company that owns, or the entity that owns the resource, like SharePoint, like our SharePoint sites, they federate with another company or another entity on the internet. And all that means is that when the other entity signs something, and there is a bit of signing going on here, and sends it to us, we believe it. So if we set up some kind of federation with Google, with a Gmail account, when a person from Gmail comes in and wants to access our stuff, if they've already signed into Gmail, they carry with them that authentication. And when we get it here in our tenant, we look at it and say, okay, well, this says Fred at so-and-so, and Google says it's okay, so that must be that person. So we actually link that to a guest user at our company, not one with a password in this case, just kind of an object that represents this external person, and that's how we control their access. So we do this with a few different entities on the internet, and we're going to talk about the options for that right now. So federation is something we're going to use. We're not going to actually use that word when we're dealing with creating these guest users, but behind the scenes, that's what's going on. So how do we get this working? Well, If we want to give someone access to our resources, we actually are still going to create something. We're going to create a guest user. Only unlike the first scenario I mentioned, we're not going to create a user and a password and all that. We're just going to create a guest user and send that user an invitation to our system. Now, what does that entail? What it just really entails telling our Azure tenant, we want to invite someone, we're going to type in their email address, and that's pretty much it. They get an invite, and then they can answer that invite and come in and access whatever we've given them permission to. So the object that we create for them is going to show up in our Azure Active Directory as a guest. This guest is not going to have a password, not really going to have a username per se either. It's just going to be kind of an object that represents somebody from outside of the company. It's going to have some properties that match up when that user comes in. So in this way, we can control someone's access because we can take that object and we can give it permissions to a list, a library, really whatever else we want, but we don't have to deal with the password. The password is dealt with in this external entities directory, wherever that might be. So, where might that be? Well, that's a good question. So we have a couple of options here. One of the obvious options is, what about another Office 365 tenant? Of course, we can do that. We can, in our Office 365 tenant, send an invitation to a user in another Office 365 tenant. And then when that person comes back to get access to our resources, that federation thing will happen, and our Office 365 tenant will see that that person actually did log into this other Office 365 tenant properly. Doesn't deal with their password at all. It just knows that they logged in properly. We match them, or it matches them with that guest account we created, and then that's how we control their access. We kind of could figure that was going to happen, right? Because everybody's under this big Azure umbrella and Microsoft controls all that. But that's not the only way that we can do that. We have a few other options as well. What about people who don't have an Azure tenant, an Office 365 tenant? Well, Microsoft has also set up federation with some consumer directories. Now you might guess they've set up federation with their own consumer directory. Of course they have. Anyone that has a Microsoft account, and Microsoft named these or renamed these Microsoft accounts. These are personal accounts. They used to be called Live IDs and I don't know, a couple of other things. But these are personal accounts. For the most part, if you sign up with one of these, you usually get an Outlook.com email address, but you don't have to. It could be Hotmail or really any other email address. They're in Microsoft's consumer directory. So they've already set up federation with that. So we could send an invitation to somebody with, for instance, an Outlook.com email address. And once that person authenticates with their Outlook.com, they can come in and access the things that we've given that guest account access to. In fact, if they come in before they've authenticated to Microsoft or wherever their username is, they'll be redirected and told to log on to their directory, wherever it is, whether it's an Azure directory or a Microsoft personal account. So where else? Well, Microsoft has also set up this federation with Gmail accounts, the personal Gmail accounts. Now, they didn't set this up to work right away with all their Office 365 tenants. So you as an Office 365 administrator will actually have to do some work to get this set up. You're going to have to go to Gmail, set up a little bit of information there, and then come back to Office 365 and finish the setup. It's not hard to do, but the second you do that, it will have set up the Gmail federation. And so anyone with a Gmail account can be invited to come in to access our Office 365 resources at that point. What about people who aren't in Azure Active Directory, who are not in a Microsoft personal or consumer account, or aren't in Gmail? What about everybody else? Well, we have a couple of options for those people as well. Now, we can just send an invite out to just some random email address. And if that email address is not in Azure, it's not in Gmail, it's not in Microsoft's consumer, what can happen, and what actually has happened until recently, is whatever their email address is after the @ sign, when they come in, Microsoft Azure will do a tricky kind of thing. It'll actually create a tenant on the fly for them. And it sounds crazy, but if they came in with some email address, some domain name that wasn't already registered in Azure, it would actually get them registered for that and let them in like that. It's a little weird, but that has happened, or that can still happen. We don't prefer that to happen because that tenant can easily be taken over, and it's really not a great way to do things. So recently, Microsoft has provided 2 other ways to deal with users who are outside of the Azure umbrella and outside of Gmail and Microsoft's consumer account. One way that they provided to let people who have other email addresses in is with a one-time passcode. Now we can send an invite to some email address that doesn't get taken care of by any of those first 3, and we can actually send them an invite that will give them a one-time passcode. So when they come and access our Office 365 resources, they are actually given this passcode, they enter that in, and they get access. That's a good option as well, although they will have to keep entering in a passcode now and again. It actually does offer a good way to do things without having them create that tenant on the fly and without having them to come in anonymously, for instance. So it's a very good option. It's called the OTP option. Even more recent than the OTP option is one more option that actually is called federated. I know I used that term earlier, and for good reason. It's actually how things work. Well, Microsoft has now given us the ability to set up our own federation with some external entity that has an STS server, a security token signing service. Microsoft's version of this is called ADFS. Well, if there is a company out there that has a service like that, either on-premise or a cloud service like that, we can actually set up federation with them manually. It's pretty much or very similar to the federation that Microsoft has set up between Azure tenants and between Azure and Microsoft's consumer accounts and between Azure and Gmail consumer accounts. Very similar to that. We just, as the Office 365 administrators for our tenant, we're going to have to set that up manually. So it's a little more work, and I believe as of right now, January 2020, or February 2020. It's still in preview, but it's a new thing. It does provide flexibility with using these other companies that don't fall under the other umbrellas, and for companies where we don't want to use that one-time passcode, because if we're getting a partner company to come in and they have a few hundred users, the one-time passcode really doesn't work, and we don't want to force them into some other option. So this federated option actually is a pretty good option. Even if they don't have an STS server, they could actually set one up, and then we could federate with that. Okay, everybody, that pretty much does it. That was a quick overview on guest/external access into our Office 365 tenant. It's a work in progress, as is all things Microsoft, and especially Office 365 and Azure. Microsoft is improving the process slowly but surely. I think they have a lot of good options out there, including options to give other Office 365 tenants access, some of the consumer accounts access, and then third party through federation, giving them access. So we do have a lot of options now to give guest users access to our Office 365 resources without having to create actual user accounts and passwords for them. We still create an object for them, a guest object, and that's how we can control their access to different things. We can put those guest objects in groups, for instance, but we don't have to deal with the passwords, and that's the key to flexibility and diminishing our administrative overhead with using these guest accounts. that want to get into our Office 365 and get to our resources. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.